We're delighted to welcome you to the Exchange by Northern Trust, an interactive conversation around the art of collecting. The following panel, Arts Funders Forum, Next Era Arts Funding, is presented in partnership with Arts Funders Forum. Designed to increase private funding for arts and culture, AFF is an advocacy, media, convening, and research platform for engaged philanthropists and funders, artists, experts, and influencers to come together to develop new models of impact-driven financial support for the cultural sector. Today's program is being video recorded for archival and possible future promotional purposes. Note, any audience questions or interactions will not be included in future promotional materials. Our moderator today is founder of MCW Projects and Arts Funders Forum, Melissa Cowley Wolf, who will introduce today's panelists. Please join me in welcoming.
Hello, everybody. It's really great to be back in Chicago after way too long. And I want to thank Northern Trust as well for hosting us on this wonderful stage and bringing us all together today. So as Kate said, I'm the founder of a consulting firm and also a media and research platform that's dedicated to expanding the next generation of cultural philanthropists, advocates, and audiences, specifically in the United States, but we also work with international partners around the globe. And I come to this work after 15 years of institutional fundraising for art museums and art schools. And I was noticing over the time that I was doing that huge changes in terms of how the younger generations and incoming generations of philanthropists were viewing the art sector very differently than their predecessors, the traditional philanthropic class. And so the work that I focus on is how do we engage that next gen in what we do, given everything that's going on in the world. So I'm going to throw a lot of statistics at you to get this conversation started so that we're all kind of aligned on where these wonderful speakers are coming from. And so I'm sorry, I'm going to be reading some notes because I can't remember it all, especially on a Sunday. So the title of the discussion, Next Era Arts Funding, what does that mean? We're talking in this panel about private philanthropy. So funds donated to cultural institutions by individuals, foundations, and corporations, not from the government. That's not the topic of our conversation today. Those of you in this audience probably know, but to be clear, in the United States, the arts are not supported entirely by the government, and art institutions could not exist without private support for the arts. This is very different from other countries where the government is largely the biggest supporter of cultural institutions. We don't have a minister of culture in this country, and we don't have a representative in the president's cabinet representing the arts, culture, and humanities. The National Endowment for the Arts is our Obi-Wan Kenobi. They're our only hope. In 2021, the NEA budget was $167 million. There were additional funds last year of $135 million that were provided by the American Rescue Plan as a result of COVID. And the 2020 budget was proposed at $201 million, and the 2023 budget at $203 million. This is no comparison when you look at private giving, which totals around $19 billion to arts and culture in the United States. So you can see we're completely dependent on private funding in this country. So against this context, in this context, we're currently experiencing the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. It's estimated that upwards of trillion dollars is going to be transferred from one generation to another. And along with that, there's about 600,000 millennial millionaires currently in the United States. And by the end of this decade, their wealth will have increased by 5%. So this is happening, and we're in the middle of it. So this group that we're going to talk about today, both heirs to this large transfer of wealth, but also the new wealth creators that are coming into their philanthropic maturity in this country, that are studied by everyone, advertisers, corporations, the philanthropic sector, the wealth managers are all looking at this incoming generation because of their power in the marketplace. So instead of calling them next generation or next gen, which is the typical term, we think about this through a psychographic lens, that this is really the next era. These are folks that can be 65, 70 years old, or 21 years old, but they're philosophically aligned, much more so than they're demographically aligned. So again, these heirs and these wealth creators share this philosophy that they want to make transformational change through their giving. They want to create immense social impact, and they want to drive global progress. So perhaps on a scale we have yet to see, and we've seen some big scale philanthropy around the world. So another way to think about this next era is to think about them ushering in a massive era of impact. Their focus is on racial and social justice. It's on climate justice. It's on creating more equity and equality, and specifically, they're seeking more measurable results of the impact of their giving, much more so than previous generations. So why is this important? Why is this important in the context of this conversation, the context of an art fair? COVID, and we've all heard this phrase for a long time, has accelerated everything. We've also had economic uncertainty for the last couple years, and we've had really this a crescendo of a social justice reckoning. And so this has also accelerated changes to arts giving. So prior to COVID, arts giving was staying stagnant or was in decline. It was staying stagnant of 4% of overall charitable giving year after year. While there were little increases or decreases here and there, overall, when you compared it with the other sectors, it was staying stagnant at 4%. We've also seen through research previously that this next era was turning away from the arts to support other areas where they saw more impact, as I mentioned, racial, social justice, environmental justice, education, and health. Along with that, there was a recent study by Impacts Experiences, which is a data and research firm, I believe based in Chicago, that shows that the arts sector has been experiencing negative substitution. And what that means is that the number of people who are leaving the sector outpaces those who are entering. And this is, when you look at the visual arts and then the performing arts, this is even more staggering in terms of the performing arts. The percentages are much higher. So there aren't enough people literally filling the seats that have been filling the seats before. There was also a recent study, many of you may have seen by the Art newspaper. They do an annual visitor study. And they've noted that international museums have yet to return to attendance of pre-pandemic levels. It's very, very, very slow. So you put this all together, and the trend lines are moving in the wrong direction. So perhaps the most worrisome, and the thing that I paid a lot of attention to, is a study called Giving USA. It's an annual study of overall charitable giving across all sectors in the United States. It's the longest running and most comprehensive. And the 2021 report, which was on the year of the pandemic, 2020, showed that giving in the United States broke records. In a year when every single industry needed to make its case for relevance, showed that they were experiencing emergencies because of the pandemic, gifts from individuals, corporations, bequests, and foundations totaled over $471 billion. This was the biggest increase we've seen in year after year. Giving USA breaks down the sectors into 9 different charitable sectors, right? Social services, health, education. Arts, culture, and humanities is one. 7 of those 9 sectors saw record growth for the giving in 2020. But arts and culture did not. We saw a decrease of over 8% when adjusted by inflation. And if I had a PowerPoint up there, you'd see all the graphs moving in the positive direction, and then arts and culture sticking out to the left. We lost a lot of money that year, and year over year giving was the biggest loss we've ever seen. So this is really staggering when you consider that our industry, arts, culture, and humanities, represents a greater portion of the economy than transportation, tourism, and agriculture, okay? So what was interesting to us, those of us on this stage and those of us who work with me at the Arts Funders Forum, was that in a year where, in 2020, when we saw people turning to art to stay safe and sane during the pandemic, especially those moments of high quarantine, it was kind of an assumption that people would realize the importance of art in their lives. We're streaming everything, we're downloading, we're making things. We didn't see that play out in the numbers at all. The case was not made to support an industry that was helping you do this and getting you through. So the question is why? And the research that we did at the Arts Funders Forum and others have done, we saw a consensus among surveyed funders that cultural leaders and funders alike that say that the sector has not done a good job of expressing its relevance, that it's viewed as a nice to have, not a must have. It's been viewed as a status thing, not a necessary thing. So the heirs of this wealth transfer and these new wealth creators alike have told us that they don't think giving to the arts is a good investment. And so why? They don't see arts organizations as contributing to a better world. They don't see arts organizations as having a profound impact on their communities. They don't see arts organizations as serving anyone but the elite. They're asking questions. This psychographic cohort is asking questions about how do they drive progress in communities with their giving? How can they use their giving to solve global challenges? How can they create deeper and broader impact? And how can they create more equitable and democratic systems? They hear this all day. That's why they're nodding. So you put this all together, we are confronting a rapidly increasing threat to the traditional cultural funding model. It's more critical than ever that we update our models to align with this next era and this cohort. We have to be open to fundamental change. We have to better prove our social value and our impact, our meaning and our relevance. And we have to talk about how the industry is going to respond to this, and that's going to determine whether or not we survive. So, with that lovely situation outlined, I'm thrilled to have with me three wonderful, wonderful colleagues who I really believe are at the forefront of making change and really challenging the status quo through their various roles. So, I don't like reading bios, and I've talked enough. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you about how they approach this work and where their philosophy is with regards to everything that I just talked about. So directly to my left, we will start with Whitney Hardy.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Northern Trust and Chicago Expo, for having me here. And of course, joining these amazing folks. This is going to be a good conversation. Melissa's prepped you guys well with those stats. So I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. I am actually more of a for-profit entrepreneur, right? So I moved back to my hometown of Memphis back in 2014. And when I came back, I saw there was a lot of gaps. Like, I'm starting an agri-logistics business, and then I have friends that are in opera and everything else. And I'm like, why aren't y'all just doing this, right? Like, so I'm looking at how entrepreneurship centers work. I'm looking at economic development and how that conversation around tech and innovation is going in, and the arts has been left out. And I'm like, it's really, there's some things that if we plugged in the resources into these gaps, we would see our creative economy in Memphis really grow at the same speed as we talk about small businesses and et cetera, because those creatives are essentially starting those ideas. They are becoming the small businesses. They're going into being a part of government actions, how we design our parks and more, but they're not being respected alongside the economic development conversation. So Hardy Beverages is my company, but Third Space is the nonprofit that I founded in Memphis in order to start plugging in those gaps, to find how do we get access to capital and look at funding in a more complex way than just saying even just private donors, or who are the new donors, who are the new people that are the audience that we've been ignoring, what are the technical resources that if we gave creatives that in the same way that I could give a tech entrepreneur, how far could they scale? And then how much could we grow our city? So I really plugged in those ideas coming from that for-profit entrepreneurial world and really started carrying it more into the creative space to support them in that light. So excited to be here from Memphis and representing the South.
Thank you, Whitney. Chris Alfieri.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Thanks also to the Chicago Expo and Northern Trust. Chris Alfieri, I have the position of President and Board Chair of Prospect New Orleans. I'm a lawyer at the firm of Christovich Kearney in New Orleans, and I subspecialize in art law. So I came onto the board of Prospect in 2007, just a year after we were founded. Shortly after that, after Prospect 1, we were significantly over budget, and we had a major departure of the board. And so what was left was 3 board members who continued on to today. Those 3 board members, myself, Susan Brennan, and Bill Fagley, form the core of what is now the current board of directors for Prospect. Prospect is a place-based triennial exhibition of international contemporary art. It is really as much about New Orleans as anything else. We invite artists to the city to do work which engages with the city. And so in that sense, it differs a little bit from other biennial and triennial exhibitions where artists come in and then depart. We really invite artists to engage with the city, engage with the community, and to really get their hands and feet in the culture of the New Orleans, which it's New Orleans. It's a 300-year-old city. It's incredible. So there's lots to do for artists. And it's through that engagement with the city that I believe we tend to produce work which engages with communities. And in that sense, I think that we have set ourselves up, positioned ourselves to really appeal to some of the concerns that we've just been talking about here today.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Abby Pucker. Thank you, Northern Trust and Chicago Expo also, and Melissa for bringing us together. And also just, I don't know if Tony's in here or not, or running around running the fair. And I see Kate, I think, back there. But I just want to specifically thank you both for your support of me and what I'm doing in Chicago, but also of Chicago generally. And it's interesting because I think all three of us here are doing work that's very much about our cities and about place-based work, but really rooted in how can we use arts and culture to invest in our cities and make them places that feel more equitable, more just through the arts, which sort of Melissa was speaking to in terms of what Next Gen or the new era of funders are trying to do. So I just wanted to call that out specifically. I am from Chicago, have been living out of Chicago for the last 12 years. I went to school in New York and then moved to LA and have been sort of ping-ponging back and forth, doing business development and also producing, and have a very weird trajectory that sort of, I worked at Sotheby's and then I worked at a tech company and sort of learned about workforce development, and at the same time was producing a play in Chicago about masculinity and opening an office for this tech company in Chicago. And through all of these sort of different things, realized that there's more similarities than there are differences in all of these different sectors. And I think what I also realized is how interested the civic community here was in investing in things that were going to make the city better, but I don't know if they necessarily saw art as the way to do that. And so what I do has become, how do we position art as civic engagement, but not necessarily making it feel the same as a lot of other arts institutions have done in the past, I think. How do we do it differently so that we can bring different communities together in the city around art, even if they don't think that they like art, or they don't think that art is for them, or they don't think that they belong in the conversation around art. So I started a platform called Gertie, which is named after Gertrude Stein, because she did that. She brought people from disparate parts of, specifically, I think, the cultural ecosystem together, who might not have known each other, to have conversations that I think led to real cultural innovation. And so the first project that I've done here in Chicago is called Skin in the Game. It is an exhibition in Fulton Market, and I did that with my amazing partner who is here, Zoe Lukov, who curated an incredible show that I actually saw at Miami Basel and in December. So we met 4 months ago, and somehow she trusted me with her incredible show when I said, we have to bring this to Chicago. Because the idea of Skin in the Game is really about sort of what it means to have skin in the game. It's about skin, and I won't say it as well as Zoe does, but it's about sort of skin as a border to sort of like, you know, keep things out, but also something that lets things in. It's about transmission. It's about what does skin color mean in terms of risk tolerance? What does it mean to have skin in the game for different people? It's just it's a really amazing show. And I saw it in Miami, and I said, this is so relevant to Chicago. And it's in Miami. It was in an old surf shop on Washington and 16th. And I was like, this is amazing because it's such a confluence of different communities that feel comfortable in this space. It feels like a neutral space. And so we ended up bringing it to Fulton Market, and it is at 400 North Peoria. I think everyone should go see it. And it's in no small part to Expo and Tony, who really is trying to invest in the city. That is a huge sort of missive of Expo. And so I just kind of wanted to say thank you again to Tony.
Thank you. Let's start here. And I'm actually, for the first time, seeing a lot more threads in the work that you guys all do in terms of play space, which we didn't really talk about previously. But Abby, you said in your remarks that communities that have traditionally felt like they don't have a place, and something I mentioned at the beginning about the lack of perceived social value of the arts or impact. And a lot of this is because the stories that we've been telling as a sector are geared towards certain audiences. Can you all talk a little bit about what you think the stories are that the sector has been telling, why you think it's not working, and what are the stories we need to tell?
Sure. I'll jump in. I think one of the stories, or the best branding that museums all over the world sort of have, is this idea that museums exist for a public. And I've really been thinking a lot about that recently, and we talked about that on our prep call. Do they actually exist for the public? Do all of them? I think some of them do. But I think part of the reason why people don't feel comfortable in those spaces is oftentimes because the programming actually isn't for them. It's for boards, and it's for donors, and it's for the market implications that it has for collectors and for donors to have a show of a specific artist that institution wants to support. And so I think when we don't talk about that, and we sort of say, yes, these are spaces for the public, it makes people, the general public, feel like it's their fault that they don't feel comfortable in these spaces. And I think that's a really interesting thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I know you both also have been thinking about.
Chris, and I'm not going to take moderating, but we were at dinner last night, and you
guys went to dinner?
We did.
Wow.
It was
so
terrible.
busy.
We couldn't find you anywhere.
It was a dream.
tried.
We
couldn't
weren't
find
really
you.
at dinner. No, but you defined, I think, just going right off of what Abby just said, you defined to me the idea of audience and community and how we have to reshape that. Could you share that again?
Yeah. We think about community engagement and audience engagement differently, right? We think about community engagement during the period of time before we actually create the artwork, and then audience engagement occurs after it's up. So the important work that you need to do to position that work to be appreciated, I think, by the public is that's a long thing. I do also want to just hook back to something I said in the introduction when I just dropped out there that we had a massive board resignation. The reason that I said that was because it has caused us to be an incredibly nimble organization that is constantly having to reinvent itself. And we have the luxury of doing that. We are not a brick and mortar institution. We don't have walls. All of our employees work from home or from wherever they are. And it's really artist and curator driven. And so we're on a 3-year cycle, but we put a lot of thought into picking an artistic director. And then we just let their creative horses run. We will tell them we think that we can fund for 50 artists or 60 or 70, but beyond that, that's about it. There's really no institutional filtration that occurs. They invite all of the artists. Frequently, the board doesn't even really know who's going to be invited or doesn't keep up with it. But that whole process of that arc that begins with the invitation of artists and then coming in to pick their sites and to think about where they want to do work, and again, thinking about New Orleans itself, that whole process is where they're able to engage with communities. And then when we get hold of it, when they say, okay, we're ready to open, that's when the audience engagement takes place. And, I'll just credit our amazing audience and community engagement manager, Taylor Holloway. She said, you know, she made that observation, so I kind of stole it from her. Okay. Yeah. But, she said that that's really the most important work that we do. And also, when it comes to audiences, Prospect is really for New Orleans. It's not for New Orleanians specifically. So sometimes we get into a conversation with the board where they're like, I wish more people would come locally. We're doing this amazing thing. We have people coming in from Tokyo and Copenhagen. Why don't we have people coming in from, and the reason is because you have one moment to engage with an audience, either on Instagram or connecting with the artwork, and that moment could lead them into an appreciation of the broader exhibition. But if you miss that, you miss it. So again, the focus for us is really about doing work for New Orleans.
No, I mean, I think that's perfect, and exactly what you were saying. When I came back to Memphis and I was like, what does the art community need? The first thing I did was go ask the artist, right? And I walked around the community and I said, hey, why have you never gone to this institution? And they said, oh, I didn't know I was even supposed to be able to go in there. Like, I know it's free or it's $5 and I can afford it, but they're not doing anything that's geared towards me, right? And so at the same time, we're hearing about donations are going down or X, Y, and Z. And I was like, well, your donors are dying and you haven't recruited their children and they don't care about you, right? And they don't care about you because you never thought they were important enough to be introduced in the first place, right? And those children, the next generation of it, they're out hanging out with the artists, right? The relationship is built. And so I really went out and said, I need to figure out what's broken in this system. And it had to look beyond just Memphis, right? And it went to how much money is coming in nationally into our city, how do our banks work, and having those conversations of who's in those meetings. So I'm going to an art opening. It's a ton of bankers, a ton of lawyers, a ton of doctors. Then I go into the community, and the artists don't know how to do a contract, how to get a loan, how to do personal finance, how to protect their work. And I'm like, so I'm confused on what y'all said there couldn't be a conversation or there couldn't be a relationship built. And I'm like, there's a missing thread. So our original name was Young Arts Patrons because I was really set on bringing in that next piece of it. And then we changed to Third Space because the idea of Third Space is connecting people from space one, which is home, and work with it, which is the second space. And the third space is where you travel in between, right? So when you're commuting from home to work, you're listening to music, you're thinking about things. You probably are going to think about the TV show you're going to watch as you're going home, the series. But you're also going to probably go pick up food, and you're going to do all these other things. So why aren't we emphasizing more of the third space of our city that happens outside of just going? AutoZone is a big place in Memphis, and Alsac and everything else. So if those are our major employers, right, what are all of those workers doing between being at home and going to work? And how are y'all not catching them in the commute in between when I know they want to be involved? And it's having the conversation. It's doing the work, like you guys are saying, and then not being such a massive group. Like, honestly, so I'm the founder, and then I have a great board of about 5 women, and that's it, right? Like, if it was, we produced Memphis Art and Design Week. We studied everything from Chicago Expo Chicago all the way to Prospect and said, what could we figure out from what we talked about with our artists in creating new programming that they're not doing, right? So it was all these things and going into find the audience, create the programming, identify the problems, and just go. But the funding wasn't necessarily there to support that. You just had to do it, which I think goes to what you're saying. Being nimble helps, but that doesn't mean you have enough capital at the same time to do the work. So it's a lot of conflict that comes in there too.
We focus a lot on the storytelling, and we focus a lot on the definition of community and audience because from our conversation, there's the story that we tell ourselves in these moments and within our institutions and between our curators and our audiences, and then there's the story that we project. And there's usually, it usually doesn't line up. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. What is the story that, we're having these conversations within our institutions and within our leadership, but we're not necessarily breaking down that wall or making it transparent enough or making it relatable enough. So what are some of the things that you've seen that work? Because as we're, connecting this audience back to the funder, it's a feeder program. If people are excited and energized by what you want to do, you share values and you are aligned, your mission aligned, they're going to want to support you, right? And one of the things we talk about is how do we create more democratic systems of funding so that you're not relying on $35 million from Mr. or Mrs. X, $40 million from so-and-so. But how do you create an ownership in a community so that everyone feels like they have a role and they're giving back and they're supporting it and they're stakeholders in that institution? And that takes us back to the storytelling, right? So what is the story that you see our sector pushing out, and how does it need to particularly change? And I'm going to go back to you, Chris, in terms of what you do at Prospect, and really something you say a lot, which is we let artists lead the way and tell the story.
That is true. As I said, once the artistic directors pick the artists, they really engage in a dialogue and a curatorial dialogue, but also a dialogue with the city. We have a lot of partners and constituents around the city that we have sort of built relationships with over time, and those curators, usually coming in from outside New Orleans, have the opportunity to engage in that way. But I will say that a huge challenge for us, and it goes back to budget, is we raise for the big show, and that's been a problem for us too, because I won't name the funder, but at one point they were like, we'd love to help you out, but you're an arts festival. And I'm like, we're a festival? What is a festival? It just got me so angry. I was like, we do so much more than that, but we're not doing as much as we can do and as we would like to do. And part of that is because, it takes around $4 million to put together the exhibition that we show at the end of 3 years. And so along that way, we really have to think carefully about how we're going to have the funding for programs. And we don't want it just to be panel discussions with an artist, periodically during the 3 years. We really want them to engage. So each time we do the exhibition, we do that in a little bit better way, certainly. I have a question for you. Can I be moderate? Okay, so the breaking down of the walls, coming from the sort of museum institutional background, I think that's interesting too, because, one way to create relevance with audiences is to kind of like turn the museum inside out, right? For us, I don't know how many people necessarily feel comfortable walking up to a museum with those huge pillars, and they don't have the vocabulary and they don't have the experience, and they're just like, I'm not going to go there. Have you struggled with that?
Have I, in the projects that I've done, struggled with that?
Yeah.
No, because I don't think that I see, I don't market to like an art crowd. Like, I don't see myself as an art world person. And I think that actually is very helpful, because that means that my audience is way bigger than the art audience. So like at the opening of Skin in the Game on Wednesday, we had 750 people come through over a 3-hour period. And there were a lot of people who came up to me and they said, like, hey, where did all these people come from in Chicago? And they were mostly art world people in Chicago. And how did you get such a diverse group here? And I was like, well, very few of these people are like actually the people who you would expect to see at an art opening or at a museum function, because these are the people, I think, who, Whitney, you were talking about, right, who work at Company X and don't just want to think about Company X for their whole lives. They also want to do other things in the interim, in the time between in those third spaces. And so I haven't had that issue because I think of all of my projects as these third spaces. And for me, I think another story, to go back to storytelling, Melissa, that we tell that I don't know why we tell is that you have to choose between being an art person and being a person who likes sports, or being an art, doing intramural sports or going to an art opening. Like, for me, my whole goal in everything that I'm doing is to have people be as excited as they are about joining an intramural sports team as they are about going to the opening of Skin in the Game, or going to the opening of an amazing show at the MCA or the Art Institute, or name your institution. And I think the reason that people were excited about Skin in the Game is because the way that Zoe and I thought about it was, how do we get people together who are unlikely people, but will be able to have a conversation that they might never have been able to have through interacting with art and through being in the space together. And we also realized, this is something that I really deeply believe, I don't think that people go to sports games all the time because they love sports. They go because they want to be with people. They want to be in community. And so I think what you're saying about sort of community development versus audience development is really interesting as well, because to me it's all community development. Like, it's all about how do we create these moments for people to have exchange and to have opportunities to get to know each other better through art. And I think that's where institutions fall short. I've talked to a lot of marketing people and comms people at these institutions who are like, well, we're trying really hard to diversify and age down our audience, but we just can't figure it out. And then you see the kind of content that they're putting out. I often look in the airport when I land. These giant arts institutions have these huge billboards that have really bad imagery. And even that, it's like, I don't want to go see that show. But if I saw something that was way more exciting from the same show, and then I understood where I could actually go to understand more about the show, or even better, how could I follow an artist that's in that show? How could I follow the director of that show? I think institutions get it wrong when they think people are going to come here for the content. I think people are going to come here for the experience and the exchange. And so how do we sort of pivot to thinking about it that way?
And I mean, to just piggyback off of that, right? If you think about it only in that context, your institution's not going to be sustainable, right? Because you've skipped over all of the marketing aspect. And I know I'm coming from direct-to-consumer and CPG and all that fun stuff that we're always bombarded with, but much to what you said, there's data that should tell you what your audience is looking at, right? And it doesn't have to be super crazy. Most organizations have an email list, and if you just kind of look at your open rate and who's opening it and what you're doing with that, segment it out, all these things that you can do and focus, you can direct to the audience that you're talking about. But I think we think, we're going to keep driving this machine the same way we've been doing it, and then we run into these walls. And when Third Space came in, my initial thing was to actually truly work with institutions. I was like, hey, I will build the thing that's the gap. I don't want to keep it, though, because I don't think nonprofits, you shouldn't have the same mission for 200 years. That means you're probably not doing the work. I'm going to say it's not working. Pivot. I was like, I'll do that for you, right? And it was really hard for them to see the value in that, because they're like, why? I can just keep doing the thing that keeps going. But the thing is, then they all hit financial issues, like I was saying before. The donors were changing. The grant reasons were changing. What defines DEI was changing, right? And my organization was 5 years ahead. I was like, well, y'all figure it out. I was trying to help you, but you rejected me because you said I was too young or I'm from outside of this. And I was like, and this is why nobody's coming inside.
But when your budget is 80% from major foundations and, ultra high net worth individuals as donors, it doesn't matter if it's not working. There is no audience attendance during COVID, and all of these institutions are still around. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm really happy they're still around. But that should show you that it's actually not about audience attendance.
Oh, I mean, one of the stats, Abby, that I sit on a few grant committees around the U.S., and I'd preached this a bunch. I said the smaller organizations are doing more of the events and activities than the bigger organizations. They're hosting these the things for artists, they're hosting the openings themselves. They're doing more things. They were like, no, we're gonna keep giving more money to the bigger institutions. COVID happened. Who was producing the most things on Zoom? Honestly, it was the artists that were like, I'm gonna play music. I'm gonna go out on my patio. That was not organized by a big institution. That was the arts community saying, people are sad and we're gonna do our job and we're gonna represent what we're supposed to be in this city. And I think that was like the disconnect that also the artists were like, I don't, like the institutions were disconnected from the fact that the artists said, I don't need y'all to do the art. Right? And like, they didn't crumble, but I think they are suffering, and they're gonna suffer for probably the next decade unless they fix that relationship that they messed up with artists. Like, in creatives in general, I just won't just say artists because there's tons of ways to be defined as a creative, but investing into them, they neglected that in a very pivotal time.
On that point, I want to say that listening is humbleness, and listening is, that's what it's all about. And we put all of the work into various venues throughout the city, again, because they're historically or culturally significant venues. A few of them obviously are museum spaces for security and climate control, things of that nature, but there may be just a group of housing in the Treme neighborhood, which is now the New Orleans Museum of African Art. When we put work in there, once upon a time, I think we would go and say, clear your decks. In 3 years, we're going to bring you some really great programming. Trust us. It's great. We've got international curators. You're going to love it. And it was so, I'm not saying that happened all the time, but I have heard over time from, institutions, some of these smaller venues saying, like, we want to be more part of the deliberative process. And again, that has worked. So when you create that partnership with an organization that already has their own constituency, you're benefiting from it. And the artist benefits from putting the work there. And it just becomes more of a dialogue, and it just, again, sort of increases something more, sincerely.
I want to tie a few things together, and then I want to talk about the elephant in the room, and then I want to leave some time for questions. So, because we can talk for a really long time, the four of us. So, you all represent institutions or entities that don't have traditional bricks or mortar spaces. You've talked about how those organizations can be more nimble and have shown that they've been more nimble and more focused on artist engagement promotion in the context of the pandemic. That plays into this next gen, next era feeling of this distrust of institutions, which is at an all-time high across the board, whether it's a nonprofit, a corporation, a government. Trust, several studies, you're all nodding, has never been this low. So the nimble organizations that can pivot, that can change, that can keep their focus on the artist, that can respond to the moment quickly, at a low budget because they don't have a building that they're suffering under the weight from because they can't open the doors, have been able to be more nimble over COVID. On top of that, and we've talked about this, you had these COVID relief funding programs from various institutions. You had Artist Relief, which was a partnership based out of New York between the Mellon Foundation, Arcadia, et cetera, et cetera. Ford Foundation changed the way that they start to fund the arts through a bond program. A lot of this COVID relief money that happened at both the federal level, state level, and city level, it's running out. It's done this year. And this is the money that has kept these organizations afloat amidst low fundraising totals, amidst slash earn income and ticket sales. And it's running out this year. So these smaller organizations that have been engaging their audiences and communities in innovative ways that tie into the zeitgeist are the ones that are going to be able to survive, is what we're thinking. So that being said, the elephant in the room that you've all mentioned and circle around is the role of the board. The role of the board members in a traditional institution, because again, at the end of the day, it all depends on, does the board understand the trends that are happening? Do they want to reach out and have conversations with communities and audiences in new and different ways? What is their role? And you have this generational shift that is happening. And so, and this also goes in, it's a whole nother conversation we can stay for the next hour about power, wealth creation, unless you talk about power. So we're not going to go into that. But last question for you before we open it up. What do you see as the role of the board, and how does the role of the board urgently need to change? I know you all have very, very strong opinions on this. Let's just go down the line and speak about how do we need to evolve this model in order to survive and to make room and make space for other types of impact-driven investment and more diverse range of board members and stakeholders.
Whew. So, because we got time, but don't. But I think one of the things is that when you start creating the next, whatever your board's going to be, your idea, it's going to require a strategy, right? You can't just say, I'm going to change my board to being 50% artists, and if everybody in that seat before was donating $10,000 or $100,000, expect those artists are going to do the same thing, right? So I think we always see there's this huge jump. Like it's like, ooh, DEI, got to do it. So they hurry up and throw everybody on there, but then they go run up to the new board member who's a 17-year-old, and it's like, so who's going to do this invoice? And not his parents, not her parents, not their parents. And so figuring out how you create a board where every seat is important, right? Like, why are you there, right? We just talked about how if you're a lawyer, you could be giving legal advice, right? Every seat has a role. It could be time, it could be money, it could be the expertise and subject matter expert that they are. And boards need to evolve like that when they're thinking about DEI, but right now they're just trying to put butts in seats. And therefore, the butts and seat strategy is going to fail, right? Because they're just doing that to do a check mark. And that's not how you create a strategy around it. So that's my loaded answer.
Just before you talk, will you mention the fund when you talk about this as a way of connecting board to social impact?
Absolutely, yeah. So recently, in May of last year, one of our founding board members, one of the three that remained after that departure, Bill Fagley, recently, he passed away in May of last year. He was a great friend, a dear person. He died at, I think he was 84. Bill was a curator at the New Orleans Museum of Art for 50 years. He built the African collection there. He came to New Orleans he came to New Orleans right after Hurricane Betsy, believe it or not, and thought, this place is great. Like, could you imagine in the 60s after it's just destroyed by a hurricane? Anyway, he thought it was great. He then built this career at one institution, and the director said, you know, the reason I'm going to hire you, man, is because you actually have a degree in African art. Bill studied with the first Africanist, universally recognized first Africanist in this country, Roy Sieber. And he was like, yeah. He's like, because it doesn't make sense that in a majority black city, we just have a small handful of this material. We really should, increase the holdings in our collection. And so over time, he built it to, over 600 pieces, and it's considered to be a very special collection. When Bill died, he left his collection to Prospect New Orleans, which was over 900 pieces of art, and made me his executor also. Thanks, Bill. Thank you, Bill. And said, just very simply, all of the work should be sold to benefit Prospect. So we had a sale at Christie's recently where maybe 47 pieces brought in about $500,000, and the remaining pieces were sold at a local auction house. Neil brought in another 320, and we have about another 200,000 or 300,000 in art that we're still selling. So that's over $1 million, and which is it's transformational for an organization like ours. So we've established the William Fagley Memorial Fund for Social Impact. All of that money will go back into New Orleans, and the philosophy is, as we support our own city that has embraced us and supported us for so long, we're just, all boats are gonna lift together. So we're not exactly sure. Again, we don't want to overlay it with a bunch of staffing, and then we're trying to figure out the most efficient way to deliver those funds back into our community. But that is what we intend to do with it. And that was the way that a board member really said, what can I do with this? And chose to lead in that way.
Well, and there's so many things that an organization can do with $1 million, which is the budget of so many community arts organizations, and choosing to give it back into the community and support creative entrepreneurs. That's an example of a board thinking differently, having an opportunity, but thinking differently about it and wanting to reinvest and understanding that relationship with community and audience in a way that is so relevant and resonates so much. And it's fantastic that y'all are doing that. And if you're on a board, note that.
But I think also it's important, if I might, I hope I'm not like saying anything I'm not supposed to say, but when we talked in our pre-conversation, you were saying that Fagley didn't always have like the board dues to pay, right?
Right,
And
that's
so,
exactly right,
so
yes.
he was someone who wouldn't have been able to be on that board if you were thinking about boards in this one-track sort of way. And I think that's amazing. Like, by actually having someone on the board who was a diverse, represented a diverse or a different sort of perspective and expertise that actually came back like tenfold down the line.
Absolutely, yeah, that's true. And it does, you're right. Dues sort of create a bar to membership sometimes. And we try to just be as discretionary as we can on that point. We do have dues. Our board comes up with about anywhere from 10 to 12% of our overall operating budget, and that's wonderful if you can do it. But I've been the lawyer for years and years. I don't get paid. I don't send in a bill, but it's a way to do something in kind. And I think that we oftentimes just don't think about everybody that's around us. There's so many important people that we need to help continue our mission. And so, yeah, but Bill was a scholar, and it was because of his expertise that he was on that board. And now he's really like our largest donor. I think he'd just be thrilled. He'd be tickled. He had a crazy laugh. He'd be like, I can't believe this is, it's great.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And I also think that's like a good example of how we need to think differently. I'll just say, I guess my answer would be, coming back to the storytelling thread, I think in order to be a really good storyteller, there's a lot of storytellers who are good storytellers who are really like egotistical and they don't listen. But to be a really, really skilled storyteller, I think you really have to listen. And so I guess for me, I'd say that I think boards need to generally do more listening. And I think actually, Bill Fagley, that's a good example. Like, if you weren't listening to a person with expertise, you wouldn't have had him on your board, or he wouldn't have been, an integral part of it in that way. So I think listening to whoever the constituents are that, the organization is serving, and understanding then how to build a board based on that is, I think, the direction that we need to go in.
Well, I want to thank the three of you. We could talk for hours. We've been talking all weekend. I hope that you all gleaned something from this conversation. I know all three of these folks are open and available to connect over social media if you have any questions, as am I. There's a lot of dire stuff that we talked about, and a lot of challenges that we're all facing within this, and the statistics, as I said, are not great, but I do like to leave everyone with sort of a high point, which is I like to mention Mackenzie Scott and her massive giving. There was an article I have pulled up that was in the Times today about it. I haven't read it yet, meant to get to it before this panel. But she gave over $2 billion away last year, and the arts sector saw, community-based organizations within the arts sector saw the majority of her funding to the arts. And she, in the article that she wrote, her team wrote, when she announced this gift, which was called Seeding by Seeding, she talked about how the arts are essential parts of our communities. They promote mental health, they drive awareness, they promote diversity, democracy, all the good things, right, that we know the arts do as people who love them because we're in this building. But that is a fantastic example, and the more we can encourage our donors and our sponsors to talk about these impact driven issues, to talk about the social value, to not just talk about how everything's pretty and wonderful and makes us better humans. I think we've turned the page on that. We need to make this much more realistic and operate on the ground and talk to people the way that they are operating and talk to them about what they value and where they want to spend their money. So I know I can speak for all of us when I say if you're an audience, if you're a board member, if you're an artist, whatever your role is within this ecosystem, to encourage the organizations, the entities, the collectives that you work with, and through your work, stress that we need to listen to the communities that we are serving, that these organizations can be conduits to the cause to drive impact and to drive change. And you will see your community and your audiences engage with you differently and more thoroughly and become stakeholders in the institution. And to be more transparent, to open your doors, and to really embrace the people that are around you in a way that we haven't for a while. So I think we'll end there. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks.
Have a great day.